We was just sitting around and Grandad was reading the paper. Boy genius conducts orchestra to raise money. He looks a bit like you, Grandad said, and turned the newspaper round so we could see. And there was a picture of a kid, and he did look a bit like me, except cleaner. And neater, said Grandad. And smarter, said Mum. And nicer, you said. So I pulled your hair and we fought. Mum took paper and looked at it. It says the kid is a protégé, she said, and Auntie Myrtle said what a protégé was French for a special kind of idiot. And after conducting the orchestra, the kid is going to get a cheque, Mum said, 'cause what the kid was right clever and had made money for charity. I said conducting was easy and anyone can do it. It was just waving your hands in the air. Grandad said that's right, and Mum said when she needed his opinion she'd ask for it, and stomped off into the bog where she stood on the scales and shouted what they was broken because she couldn't be that heavy. When she came back, Grandad was reading out something about a Russian woman going to space as a tourist, and she had paid millions, and Grandad said as how he had fought the Russians in the war, and Mum said that the Russians were on our side. Besides, he was never in the war. He was banged up in Macclesfield most of the war. But the only way she was going to lose weight was if she went into space, but that would cost millions, so forget it. Auntie Myrtle said Mum could go into space for free to raise money for charity, like people jumped out of balloons and did parachute jumps. And Dad said that that were a good idea and I should take you as well, and I said I wouldn't go with you because you were horrible and spoiled everything, and you said you weren't horrible, but I was horrible, and we fought. Uncle Ted said he would take his wooden leg into space because he wouldn't go without it, and Mum said don't be stupid. But then she asked if she could take her makeup, because she wouldn't go without her makeup and her blue dress and her yellow skirt and those nice shoes. And she would have to get her hair done and get some jewellery because she would be famous for going into space and be on the telly and meet famous people, and she had to look proper. And we were just talking. Granny started barking and banging her head on the table and waving her hook in figures of 8. Now you've started her up thinking, said Mum, and hit me on the head. It weren't fair. I said that that's why I'm backwards at school, so she clipped me on the ear instead. It weren't fair. Granny crouched on the table and slowly span around, frothing and gnashing her teeth. Then after a bit she screamed, I'll sort it, rolled off the table and ran down the lane on her hands, holding a hook with her feet. Granny needs meat, said Mum. She's not the only bloomin' one, said Dad, all grumpy. I'm sick of ruddy spinach. Then he told everybody to shut up and put the telly on to watch the match. When Granny came back she was driving a white limousine that went on and were proper and posh. And we all climbed aboard and headed down to the shops, but Granny didn't go to the shops. She was swaying backwards and forwards and doing armpit farts in excitement, but wouldn't say what it was about. She skidded to a stop outside a bloomin' great house, and there was another limousine parked in front of us. And when he saw us, the driver got out and asked what we were doing, and Granny got out and did that thing she does, and the driver screamed and ran away, so then we had 2 limousines. Dad and me got in the front one and went on ahead. It was useful to have 2 limousines, Dad said, but we didn't understand what Granny was up to, because one was enough. But then Granny overtook us, honking the horn and swerving all over the road and waving a hook in the air, and Mum was pointing at something in the limo, but we couldn't see because the windows were dark. Dad overtook Granny and cut her off, so she drove into a ditch and Granny got out, raving, and Mum said Granny had got it sorted, and what did Dad think he was doing, driving dangerously and fooling about, and you got out and you looked happy, which was suspicious, and Uncle Ted got out, waving his leg around and saying where was the shop, and Auntie Myrtle got out, and then someone else got out, and it was a kid, all in smart clothes, and he was the same kid what was in the paper. Granny had picked him up back at the big house, and she said how he was going to raise money with him. We didn't know what she was on about. The kid looked scared, and he had reason. Auntie Myrtle tried to calm the kid down by chanting, but he looked even more scared. Dad said it didn't matter, we would get to the shops, then take the kid back, and we drove down to the town. But just when we saw the shops, Granny started gibbering and pulling at the wheel and pointing with a hook, and made Dad stop in front of a bloomin' great building, and people were going in all dressed proper and waiting around, and some were carrying funny-looking cases, and Auntie Myrtle said that they was an orchestra, and there was a man with a thing round his neck coming towards us, and Dad said what the mayor was going to say hello, and the kid we had got started shouting and carry on what he had been kidnapped. But Grandad said what's the problem, the kid was meant to be conducting the orchestra and that's where he was going anyway, and we was here, so shut up and get out. The kid started to open the door, but Granny launched herself at him and knocked him down and sat on his chest, slowly shaking her head, on her face a hideous smile, and she was pointing at me with her hook. Then Mum said, Granny wants you to conduct the orchestra. And collect the money after, said Uncle Ted. We'll keep the kid till you're done and pick you up later, said Dad. There was a kerfuffle and shouting and a whole rumpus after that because Auntie Myrtle and Granny and Mum swapped my clothes with the kids' clothes and combed my hair and brushed me and cleaned me up and told me that conducting was easy and anyone could do it. It was just waving your hands in the air. Then they shoved me out of the limousine and drove away yelling and laughing and the kid banging the windows and screaming. "We shouldn't let Granny do thinking," I shouted after the car, then turned round to meet the ruddy mare. I looked at the mayor, and the mayor looked at me. I was thinking of saying my arms didn't work today, so I couldn't conduct. But he held out his hand and I shook it, and that was that given away. "Welcome to Macclesfield," he said, all posh and proper. And his wife was standing beside him in a stupid hat, and she shakes my hand as well. Then someone handed me a phone and said it were for me. I put it to my ear, and it was Grandad shouting what the kid that they had got was okay. And after it had been explained to him what it was for charity, he said he'd help. He thought it was funny, and he's a foreigner, so you needn't say nout. And he said he wrote the music and it's easy, so don't worry. Just to keep watching the first violin, he says. Then the phone crackled and went off. I don't know what Grandad was on, so I stuck the phone in my pocket. Then a girl handed me a book and a pen and asked me for my autograph. I scratched my bum for a bit, thinking what to write, then remembered it weren't polite to think in public, so stopped and made a scrawl. If the kid were a foreigner, he were American or Russian, because I didn't know any other kind of foreigners, and Americans didn't do proper music, and they didn't have clever kids, so he had to be Russian. I knew about Russia, because Dad said they were rotten and ripped tourists off, so I thought I could do that okay, and I kept the book and the pen in my pocket. Then another girl gave me some flowers, and I thought that were good, being a protégé, so I nodded to the mayor, all important like I was ready, and they led me into the hall. Oi, it were huge in the hall. I never seen nothing like it. There was seats going upwards in all directions, and hundreds of chairs in the middle, and the people with cases were coming in and opening their cases and taking out instruments, and it was scary. But then I remembered they was going to give me a check at the end, so it was worth it. And anyway, conducting is just waving your arms around. They took me to a little room and said what they'd come back later for the makeup. And I said, what makeup? And they said I was going to be on telly, and everybody on telly had makeup all the time, so that were okay. Somebody knocked on the door, asking for their phone, but I said something that sounded Russian, and they went away, and I practiced waving my arms about. The telephone rang again, and it was Grandad, and he was shouting the cheque was for 50,000 quid, so I'd better get it, and that the kid they got was a good kid, and polite, I heard Auntie Myrtle say. And smart, Uncle Ted added. And nice, I heard you throw in. And clean. Didn't know a kid could be so clean, said Mum. So I switched the phone off and stuck it back in my pocket. Then a woman came in and put powder on my face, and smartened me up and straightened my tie and did my hair and talked all the time so I didn't have to say no. Then a bell went off and somebody outside knocked and said 5 minutes. Then someone else said that they wanted their phone back. Then someone said it's time, and the makeup woman opened the door, and I went into the corridor where there was people hanging around, and more people shaking my hand, and then they led me down more corridors and left me standing behind a big curtain that had a light beside it, and they said to walk out when the light went on. So I waited, and there was a bloomin' great searchlight shining straight at me, and I couldn't see nowt. I could hear people clapping and hollering, but I didn't know what that was about. Then the searchlight switched off, and I could see thousands and thousands of people in the seats, and they went up and all around, and in front of me there was the orchestra, and they were all standing up and clapping as well, and a man with a violin came over and shook my hand and led me to some steps. Then he went and sat down, and everyone else sat down, and there was a bit of plonking from the instruments and shifting about, but then it started to get right quiet. I walked up the steps, and at the top was a tilted desk with a book on it. I looked at the book, but it was all dots and wiggles and didn't have any pictures, so it were no good. But beside the book was a little stick, and I remembered that conductors use a little stick to conduct, so it was all right. I picked up the stick and looked down at the orchestra. It were incredible. There were lots of different kinds of trumpets and lots of little violins, and someone with a bloomin' great violin that stood up. And there was pipes and drums and a piano and stuff I didn't know what it was. I wanted to start conducting, but they hadn't started to play, so I just stood there. But nothing happened. Then I remembered to watch the first violin on the left like Grandad said, and it was a man, and it was the man who had shook my hand, and he was looking at me and I was looking at him, and nothing was happening, and it went on like that for ages. Then my nose got an itch, or I scratched it with a stick, and there was a huge bang and a trumpet went off. And then the violin started up, and there was more banging, and some pipes went off, and it were incredible. I waved my arms about like mad, and the music was like a horse race, and I jumped up and down pretending to be a horse in a race. Just when it got really exciting, the music suddenly stopped, so I figured the horse had fell. So I fell over as well. Then the violin started up by itself, and it was right slow and sad, like the horse had died. So I stood up and just waved slowly like I was sad as well. Then the searchlight went on again, and it was shining on a woman who was all dressed up, sitting at a ruddy great piano. The woman looked up at me, and I waved at her, And she started up on the piano, and she started at the bottom and went all the way to the top and then back down again, and her hands were like spiders on whiskey, but she banged away and got excited. Then everybody else got excited, then everybody else joined in, and I jumped around and shook my arms in the air. Then everybody stopped playing, although I carried on for a bit. Then everybody stood up and clapped, and that was that. When I got to the bottom of the steps, the mayor gave a boring speech and handed over a cheque. What he said was for charity. Then everybody clapped again. They took me back to the little room. I climbed out of the window and stood in the car park. Then Granny screeched in, driving the white limousine, and the door opened and the kid got out, and there was a weeping and wailing, and Mum was saying how she would miss him, and Grandad was saying he were a good kid, and it had been nice to know him, and you were crying and saying that you wanted to marry him, and Dad was saying he could come to the match with him. Then Dad looked out of the window and saw me and said, "Oh, it's you. Got the cheque?" I said I had. So Dad said, "Get in." So I got in. It weren't fair. So, before I got in, I kicked the kid in the goolies. I'm not having it. Granny said, "Give her the cheque," and she drove down the bank where she did that thing she does, and they cashed it on the spot. And we drove down the shops to get some proper food, but Granny stopped outside the bookies. Mum said that this wasn't the time to bet on a horse. Get to the shops, she was starving. But Granny was drooling and leaning over and hissing in Dad's ear. Then she poured gin all over him from the bottle she keeps inside her hook and clouted him on the head for being stupid. Then Dad suddenly got it, whatever it was, jumped out of the car with the cash and staggered into the bookies. We didn't know what he meant to do. Granny had been thinking, and when Granny has been thinking, you never know what's going to happen. Dad was ages in the bookies and Mum was getting right twitchy. When he came out, Granny wanted to get to the racecourse, but Mum put her foot down and yelled we was going to the shops, and that's that. So Granny drove to the nearest shop, did her handbrake turn parking thing, which is dead impressive in a limousine, except she squashed some little cars, and we all got out and piled into the shop. We got eggs and beans and chips and burgers and pies and pizzas and bacon and beer, and Mum shouting that that's what we bloomin' need, proper food, so we get tons of it, and go to pay for it, but Dad hasn't got any money. And Mum goes bonkers. "We had 50,000 quid, where's it gone?" she screams and shakes Dad around by his neck. Dad said that he had put 49,900 on a horse, so what's the problem? But Mum said, "Where's the other 100? And he said he had put it on a special bet, what Granny had been thinking about. And Dad shouting and Mum shouting, and the security guards come over, and we tell Granny not to do that thing she does, but she does it anyway, and everybody runs, and we run as well, and get back into the limousine, and Granny squishes a few more cars, and we head down the racecourse, and Mum says, "Where's the food?" But we had left it behind, and she goes bonkers again. Dad said, "Don't worry, it's sorted, and we'll get some chips at the races." Auntie Myrtle dug in her handbag for her special leave, soaks them in gin and rolls them into little pellets and stuck each one on a pin. Grandad ripped into one of the seats and pulls out some springs and hands them around. Dad's saying we have to hurry 'cause the race is starting in 5 minutes and that the horse he bet on is called Dancing Lady. Granny stops outside the fence of the racecourse and Dad and me and Grandad climb over the fence and get down to where the horses finish up. They was running already and we had to hurry, but we got there just as the race is finishing, and so as they crossed the line we put the pellets on the pins on the springs of the seat and ping 'em at the horses what beat our horse. And instead of just stopping at the end, the two horses keep on going but faster, because Auntie Myrtle's leaves are strong, and the riders are pulling at the horses, but they can't stop them. They just get revved up, and one of them stands on his back legs and keeps on running, and the other one stands on his front legs and keeps on running as well. And anyone can see what those horses have been taking drugs. So they don't win, but Dancing Lady does, so Dad goes to pick up his winnings. 10 minutes later, back in the limousine, Dad is waving hundreds of thousands of quid around and saying that's good. But Mum says, "Where's the chips?" But he had forgotten the chips. And Mum says that's it, she's leaving, and she's going to go and live with a family what eats. But Granny is gabbling and waving a hook around and driving back home, and nobody can stop her because she's been eating Auntie Myrtle's leaves. We drive through the kitchen wall and everybody gets out. Dad gets on the phone and orders up 100 pizzas. Granny tells Grandad to plug the Dalek into the telly so we have a computer what she needs, she says. And you and me go out into the yard and eat sweets until we're revved up like the horses. When we get back in, Grandad had hooked up the Dalek to the telly and stuck a typewriter on it, and Granny is belting out messages and looking things up and hacking into stuff and gibbering and cackling. And Mum is pacing backwards and forwards by the door waiting for the pizzas. And Dad and Uncle Ted are sitting in piles of money trying to count it. And with all the bother we had forgotten about the 100 quid what Dad had put on the special bet. That special bet was going to help Mum lose weight, loads of it, but we didn't know it then. When Granny has been thinking, it's hard to know what's going to happen.